All right, good morning. It's Thursday, February 2nd, and we're the General and Housing Committee. This morning, first up, we're going to hear from our peer, Representative Burrows, and we got a handout from her that discusses the probing equity questions. We'll follow that up for the rest of the morning with pretty much with Damien to finish the walkthrough of the bill, but also so on the agenda, what I have for today's agenda, it says committee discussion. So whenever I list committee discussion, that's what it'll be. We always have to try to list something on the agenda to let the public know what we're working on and how we're working on it. And so committee discussion can range from me, and this is what I'll do this morning because we'll get Damien around 10:30. Is simply to open the floor to conversation. Sometimes the conversation will be focused on a particular section as we get it through this bill. We are going to spend quite a bit of time on this bill through the next 2 weeks. So that's a time to raise some questions, some general. They'll start more generally, and then as we do more and more work, the questions will get a lot more specific. And so when you see that, that's what we're working on the bill. The next phrase that'll be added to that will be markup. It will be where we actually walk through the bill, as Damien just did, and go section by section to make sure that we've considered and discussed each particular section. I like to just keep going through the bill sequentially. Sometimes we'll hit a section that says, and we'll say, okay, we'll pick that up again later, and we'll keep going, and we'll keep going through the bills until we have covered every section. And then the last thing you'll ever see in italics on each bill would be possible vote. So that'll be the process that you see. So this is just a new thing that I just wanted to point out. But you'll be seeing that a lot, and sometimes they'll fill in with witnesses. As we find witnesses, you may think of people that we need to hear from, and we'll try to get them in and fit them in. But yeah, that's what we have for the protocol on what that reads in the agenda. So with that, Representative Burrows, if you could just give us a background on where this work has come from, what the goals are, besides the overarching goal. I would appreciate it. The microphone is yours.
Thanks. I know that you've given me 45 minutes, and I'm not sure. It really depends on whether people have questions or not, whether I'll take up all that time. But for the record, I am your colleague, Representative Elizabeth Burrows. I represent Windsor 1, which is Heartland, West Windsor, and I live in West Windsor. Let's see. Okay. I've given you a two-sided copy of the probing equity questions, which are a series of questions constructed by a subcommittee of the Social Equity Caucus of our legislature. Our Social Equity Caucus is actually unique in the country in that it consists of legislators and advocates and community members with lived experience about social equity issues. So those said community members got a grant from the Vermont Community Foundation about 2 years ago, and they formed a subcommittee whose purpose was to create an equity lens for our legislature. And so these questions have not been changed since, almost nothing about it has been changed since the community members got together and wrote them. They are people who have been affected by systemic racism, but the equity questions are applied to all marginalized groups of people. We would like to, the overarching goal, besides the overarching goal listed here, is the goal is to see these questions applied to the drafting phase of bills. And to get there, we have to become facile in our use of them. And they take a lot of, it's brand new, so it's going to take a lot of practice applying them. And because it is new, acknowledging that we are used to doing things a certain way and thinking about things a certain way and taking certain things into consideration. It'll take some time and some practice to know when to apply them and how to apply them. In the last 3 years, the governor's administration and our legislature have both declared systemic racism a public health emergency. And one thing that the governor did was to set up the Office of Racial Equity, which is seated at the agency of administration, so at the highest tier of our government, or at least our administration. And so at that level, we are examining things like gender identity and race and disability and age and everything else that, and as such, these issues really apply to all Vermonters. And when marginalized communities who have been left out of discussions do better, there's a saying that people who know me well are really sick of hearing me say, which is a rising tide lifts all boats. The Social Equity Caucus has asked for at least one member of every committee to commit to seeing that these questions are being asked, and to report back to the Social Equity Caucus what stumbling blocks or barriers we might encounter, so that we can all become more accustomed to and improve their use. Let's see. What else? The ultimate goal is that we won't need a tool like this, that it will become irrelevant because we are intuitively asking who's been left out and how does this affect different communities. And if we're working at the systemic level at the legislature or in our communities as school board members or as regular old members of upstanding individuals, we should be taking into account things like language needs and transportation and rural versus non-rural considerations. Part of being a legislator is taking into account people who are placed at a disadvantage by our actions. And if you are putting in systems that make things more accessible to marginalized individuals, then you are also, of course, making them more accessible to all Vermonters. Let's see. Social Equity Caucus has supports available for anybody who has questions about how to use this or when to apply it, or the questions, as you'll see, can be used at a very surface level and also can be used as, you know, triggering kind of a deep analysis. And it's not easy. It's really not easy. So we have various mechanisms to help and support anybody who might have questions about how to do that. A group of people tested the probing questions last year, and while Chair Stevens, I think you helped test them, didn't you? And we found that not all of the questions applied to all bills, but the set of questions applied to all bills, and again on a couple of different levels. And so that is my whole spiel. Does anybody, I thought we could just discuss the notion of the probate equity questions.
So on the term levels, I mean, you started off by saying this is something that would first be used as someone approached drafting a bill. So it could range from drafting a bill. I want to introduce a family medical leave insurance bill.
It's a great idea.
And let me talk to the attorney. And so, but the idea here is that the goal would be for the legislator or legislators that are asking for the bill first, are approaching it. Yes, she may. So it's up to the legislators to have an understanding as they're working on this bill and shaping what they're asking for from the attorneys, that you would use this you call it a lens, which I think is just again, I'm assuming is a way of looking at things.
Right.
And that's different than if we were going to then apply these questions on
On the committee, yeah, that's right. We have, we've also consulted with Susanna Davis of the Office of Racial Equity. And she has a set of questions that she uses for the Agency of Administration. And what we'd like to do is get closer to the two sets of questions cannot be blended. They have to remain separate, but ultimately we'd like to have these questions applied both in the drafting phase by legislators and ideally also by legislative council eventually, and then sort of touch base on the questions during our committee process. If we use these questions with ease, then and we're used to applying them in our minds when we're considering legislative matters, then it won't be as arduous.
Just a tangent.
So thank you for bringing this discussion forward. And the thing that strikes me about this is that I can ask these questions, but I don't know that I can answer the questions because you don't see it until you see it.
Right.
And so it strikes me that it's not it requires engagement. It's
That's right.
not a mental checklist.
That's right. One of the ones that I referred to has been a bill that was introduced 2 years ago that had to do with how printed matter that is generated by the state legislature, how it's stored. You wouldn't necessarily think that that was an equity question, but it has to do with accessibility by the public and people who don't have access to computers or can't use computers easily need to be able to have actual easy access to those kinds of records. So it can actually apply to again, not necessarily every question, but the set of questions and the idea of the questions. can apply to everything we do, actually.
And if you could talk a little bit about that difference again, just expand on the difference between if I think that simply having printed matter in the first floor of the State House is what we've always treated accessibility to. Everybody can insert, come to the State House and get a copy. Obviously, we live in an electronic world. So now we think, without thinking of these, that, well, it's online.
Right.
Everyone has access to it. Just, I guess, talk again about how that's not enough.
Well, I mean, it is hard to think about all of the people who might be left out versus all the people we're calling in for. I mean, it takes a lot of. For some things, it takes a lot of analysis, thinking deeply about who's getting left out. But I always think of, various community members who are isolated from things that are easily available to them. And they're my least common denominators that I carry with me everywhere I go. And one of them has a computer but doesn't use it very easily and would much rather just go to the place, go to the library, look it up, or go to and she is able to go to the library. But it's a challenge to think about who's getting left out.
Yeah, because again, from a political standpoint, not policy, but a political standpoint, even a simple thing like our town used to have a weekly newspaper that was delivered free to every mailbox. And so if I wrote a column or if there was a piece of news about a public meeting or what have you, out of the 3,500 issues that were sent, do I assume it was sent to everybody's house and they had the opportunity to read it? Therefore, I have fulfilled my obligation to do the best I can in informing people. And yet I still hear from people who say, well, you're shoving this policy down my throat. I never knew this was happening. I never knew that these meetings were going on. What are you doing here? What is all this about? Which is fairly stereotypical of, and I see parallels to when it's applied to policy, which is sometimes we feel like we don't have time to go not only down but across to get to people.
Yep. I think there are some of the questions are not quite as obvious. One of the ones that I thought was really interesting was and I swear there was a piece of legislation passed like 10 years ago that had to do with the language of bills. I know that the education funding formula is supposed to be clear and easy to understand, but one of the questions on here is how whether the language and terminology used in the bill is accessible, whether it uses language that could damage a group of people because it is arcane language, whether the language used in the bill is contemporary and therefore could become stale, but also whether the language is so convoluted that it's hard to understand by a layman. And again, things that are not necessarily obvious, but require mindful use of the questions.
Representative James?
That raises an interesting question for me, which gets me sort of deep into how we draft bills and, you know, how we work with you had mentioned ledge council. And I'm wondering what thought you've given or what conversations you've had around where the language in the bill is like statutorily required, or it's a legal definition, you know, that may sound clunky and arcane, but it refers back to a previous statute where, you know, this was defined like 10 years ago or something in that law. And if you change it in this law, it refers back to that law. And so when we talk about the drafting of bills, that's right. I'm sure this is something you've thought about.
Yes, and that's why why we're not at the ledge council level of applying these questions yet.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, it's something I don't have any idea how to overcome that. It has to be done through ledge council, but
I feel like I wish I had a better memory. I feel like we were working on a bill and it's why this triggered something, working on a bill in the education committee last year. And I don't even remember what bill it was, but we wanted to use more inclusive language and we couldn't because the phrase we were using referred back to, you know, a statutory difference and we would have had to open up that bill and, you know, so this seems like very comprehensive. Some of this seems like very deep, long-term, you know, work, which is cool. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah,
Language changes happened, 10, 12 years ago. It started to when it came to folks with disabilities. All the many names that we could call people with disabilities, and that that had to be a statutory change, a substantive change, even though all folks were doing was going through the books, doing a word search, and changing the names because of this age-old, when it was written, these were the names that were in common use.
and that's why that question is in there, whether language used is temporal in nature or whether it's kind of neutral enough to carry into the future.
Representative Tangerman, then Krasno.
My former committee, technology, we would occasionally talk about telephone services for audio and visual impaired people. And something, I just never thought about it before. And I'm thinking about, so our bills, they're publicly accessible. What if you're visually impaired? What is the means to access those? I don't know that there is one. And which then of course leads to what is a reasonable effort to make them accessible? Responsible effort? Where do you stop? And it, open question, but I mean that being an example of a glaring example is something I just never considered before. Yeah, they're downstairs, they're online, they're accessible.
Right.
But they're not in Braille.
Right.
And there's not an audio version.
Not an audio version.
Representative Krasno.
I was just gonna say, even, in this committee, when we're working on family medical leave, they in the recent years now, redefining what a family is in the language there. I'm really grateful for that. And in my own community, had many discussions about different things, daddy-daughter dances and things like that. I grew up in a single parent household and didn't have that dynamic. And I was talking too about, so they used to also have an option for our legislative business cards to have Braille on them, and they don't have that anymore.
Oh,
So I don't really, because of the new, but anyway, so I'm trying to figure that out with them. But yeah, no, I think everything that we do, I really appreciate your work. I see equity not as a separate issue, but incorporated into everything we do at the State House. And I really appreciate the Social Equity Caucus's work, and so grateful that you're bringing it to the committee attention, and it goes to, who sits in front of us and testifies, and how we can reach out to folks who to lift their voices up to come in and speak, and it's really important. Thank you.
thanks.
Statutes are a thicket as well, so it's paying attention to the language is gonna be important for a number of different reasons.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was saying to Rob when I was on the fence about, but yes, I do have a comment. I think that it's also important, and whether it's a bill that an individual member is drafting makes a difference, or if it's a committee bill that's really coming because it has a momentum of its own, whether it's just from the body more generally or leadership, that's going to have a little bit of a different process. Sometimes you're going to need to have a finished work product to really run this analysis, and sometimes you're taking a new idea off the wall that there's an opportunity to kind of run some of this on the front end. When we are reforming existing statute, I think within the backside, the repairing harm is especially important, and also especially thorny, because when we want to reform an existing statute, sometimes we want to say, we're moving forward, the old wasn't so good, let's focus on the new. And it's hard to say we're moving forward to a new construct because the old construct was inequitable, and now we're going to pause and name how it was inequitable, and we're going to name who was harmed by it, and we're going to name how this new system's going to repair that harm. That's really hard, and I think it sometimes feels like it is kind of at loggerheads or oppositional, at least, to the passage of the bill generally. I think sometimes people say, well, if we call out too much about exactly what we're fixing, some of the people who might otherwise be change makers may get, less enthusiastic about the bill because it's kind of more uncomfortable. So anyway, when we have something that we're looking backwards into our statute, I think what's on the back side of this page is especially important, because sometimes those issues are the ones that get momentum. They're moving forward. Nobody wants to stop that momentum. And yet, if we omit this step, we miss a major opportunity when we're really playing with the gears that affect people, people's outcomes. So, whether it's has to do with tax policy, education policy, just general, any policy, anything that's been on the books for a long time. So anyway, just glad it's on the back of the sheet. And that to me is just one element of a bill that is a little different than say, oh, one member drafted a new bill and now we're deciding whether to take it off the wall. We can kind of put it through this beginning filter. What I'm talking about, I think, is almost like we just finished this bill. Let's make sure now we are going through a checklist but engaging on each point to say, what's the most honest way to present both the reasoning and the hope for an outcome, the aspirational outcome for this legislation, which is sometimes a very painful thing to spell out.
Agreed. Thank you for bringing that up.
It does point up to the nature of compromise, because of course, if you're reading the statutes and you're identifying it now, anywhere from 2 to 100 years later as being insensitive, or you don't want to represent that, and you don't want the state to represent, those were built on some compromises at some point, and it's the nature of how we do our work. And so again, we're not beholden to a previous legislature's work. We can change, every legislature can change the statutes. But who wins, who loses, who compromise too much, all those decisions go into it. And that's before I think you get to where what I was hearing in Caleb's voice is like how difficult it is to reconfront those issues.
Yep.
And have those conversations. So,
But it's important, and I think it's how we actually bring big change about. is becoming used to asking those questions and applying them where we can.
Saudi is with us on Zoom. Saudi, how are you feeling today?
I'm hanging in there. I'm gonna be in this afternoon. Thank you. Good morning. For the record, Representative Lamont, and also your colleague, and also contributor to this body of work. In my previous role as a community member, and so I just wanted to thank you as a committee for holding the space for this conversation. And everyone's really thoughtful input and insights to really taking this forward and applying it and thinking of the impact and the ways in which it will and could potentially impact legislation. I wanted to add, if I may, it is also important. I heard language around, the language and intent, and the importance part of this to also acknowledge is intent versus impact. And sometimes when we are doing things with the intent for good, we have unintentional consequences. And so I think that's really what this is for, is just to really have people thinking and engaging. And someone, Representative Tangerman, you said you can't answer the questions. And that's kind of intentional. That's the point. The point was to bring it back, because we, as the body of legislators who are putting forth these policies, we should be including and welcoming the voices with that testimony. And so that's why the way the questions were crafted was so that you couldn't answer them and that you had to engage in a conversation with other folks to get their perspective and point of views, because there's nothing about us without us, essentially, right? And so I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for your really, really thoughtful insight and taking this seriously, and I sincerely appreciate it.
Thanks.
I apologize, Representative Lamont. I continually forget that you were part of that original group. I'm so sorry.
No worries. It's okay. That's the beauty of life, right? It's the people who have one foot here and one foot there, that lived experience, and also change makers working towards improvement, right? And so as someone who has been impacted by systemic oppression, and now as someone who's working towards changing those processes and systems, right? That's the beauty of it. And that's the goal, is to work together towards as Representative Elder had said, looking back. So right, it's not most of it is intended for looking forward on the things as we come forth, so that we can do no harm as we move forward. And then some of it is in repairing harm. And we're not going to get to it all, because there's a lot of harm, right? And so it's fine. I often, people don't realize that I wear a lot of hats and I'm in both worlds. And so it's okay. I still appreciate you. Thank you. And I appreciate all of your work. And you did a great job. I was watching on the YouTube. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, further questions for Elizabeth? Or do you have anything to wrap up with?
No, that's it. If you have any questions or you need help figuring out how to apply them or when to apply them, let me know, and or let Sadia know, and we have a whole bunch of resources available at Social Equity Caucus.
This information is being shared amongst many of the committees.
Yep.
With the goal of trying to get to all of them. And I think, we're not going to post this up on the wall as sort of an ongoing list, at least not at this point in time. It's just to have to study, to internalize if you want, if you can. And, there's not I'm not going to force the committee to approach every bill in a real structural way yet. I mean, I may never, but just, it's really, this starts with personal education and how you do your work here. And it's just, it's not meant to be a mandate. It's just going to be a way of looking, a lens of a way of looking at the work that we're doing and how it can impact folks, because every bill, I kind of look at bills and statute, bills in particular, as in a physics way, almost, in a really rudimentary way of saying there's a certain amount of matter that exists in the world, or you can call it power. And anytime somebody's trying to seek a little bit more power or equity, the people who had achieved what they set out to do in the previous bills aren't going to just gladly hand over that power. And so how we negotiate that and make compromises through our work, this is just adding something to it more than an analogy. It's adding real people to it. So,
Thank you for giving me the time to bring this to you. I really appreciate it.
no, thank you for bringing it forward. And thank you, Saudi, for your work on it so far. And I know it's ongoing. So, all right, let's take a short